Thanks for tuning in to Breaking the Frame, where we seek to free our minds from the prison of fixed worldviews. In this episode, I speak with Raven Connolly, a philosophy enthusiast and frequent contributor to the Stoa. We speak about the state of affairs in Portland, her experiences learning under Brett Weinstein, and the psychospiritual realm of womanhood. I hope you enjoy. So, we're here with Raven Connolly. Raven is a frequent contributor to the Stoa, and I'm looking forward to talking to her today about various things, psychedelics and feminism, and the state of the union in Portland. Maybe we'll start there. So you're in Portland right now. Things are crazy and wild. Can you kind of give some insight into maybe some of the more frame-breaking experiences that you've had in Portland?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's interesting. I think living in Oregon has been kind of like it's like being at the epicenter of what is a general kind of metaphysical battle of maybe, let's say, the gods, let's say, of like the alt left and the alt right, come
Uh-huh.
clashing in the streets. And I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, and so I've seen these types of conflicts happening throughout my upbringing. I went to the Evergreen State College, where I was friends with many anarchists. At one time, identified myself as an anarchist, and so I've seen it all. I've seen people like getting notifications that the right was going to come to town and getting their gear together and getting everyone together and having all the signal groups and when the medics come out. So I understand the spirit that it kind of holds in the radical leftist communities in the Northwest. And to see that kind of come to a head has been really interesting because for them, I mean, they've been waiting for this moment. They really have. They've been preparing for this moment for years, some people decades, kind of maintaining their organizations and resisting the power structures here. And so now it's just kind of really excessive, something that had been part of the culture, but had been relatively contained because there were other people living their day to day lives, um, filling parks and the streets with general human activity, basically kind of renegated those clashes to very specific events. But of course, with lockdown and quarantine, all of those other kinds of activities have now, dissolved, and the kind of normal everyday people are stuck in their homes, and it left the streets open, a territory that the anarchists already feel like is theirs. And so I think that with the igniting of the moment with the George Floyd protests, that really was just kind of blowing the candle to create a huge flame that basically sustained itself in Portland for over 100 days of protesting over the summer.
Has it
Um,
calmed down at all?
yeah,
It has. Okay.
oh yeah, the fires really helped.
Okay.
Ironically, right?
Yeah.
It's so funny. The authorities, like the human authorities, the police, have not really contained the protests, and that's because of like political dynamics between the mayor and him also being the chief of police and some weird things about the structure of the city of Portland. And he's been basically very, some might say lenient, I guess. But other people would say he's still a bad guy. So I don't know. It really depends on your perspective
Yeah.
when it comes to that. But the fires and the smoke was so bad that nobody could go outside, and that really, I think, caused a hard stop with the protests. And they haven't really picked back up super feverishly as of yet. But I think that's also because there have been federal officers doing very targeted arrests of organizers. So I think that that's also a factor in why people aren't back in the streets.
Yeah, disappearing, some would call it. Disappearing people off the streets. I saw some videos that felt like that. Was there a sense that like the right was always preparing for this too? I remember there was an armed conflict between federal officers and people on the right that wanted to occupy, what was it, state land? It was cattle ranchers. I forget the family's name, but
Mm-hmm.
was that kind of the event that catalyzed the right, or is that something that's been going on in Washington long before that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting. We have kind of a narrow view of the right. I would at least split them into two factions. One faction would be your establishment Republicans, people who still believe in governance and like the principles of liberty and authority and um, the institution of the United States government is central to their belief system. But then there's a whole other side of the right that is very suspicious of government.
Yes.
Doesn't matter whose government it is. Doesn't matter if there's a Republican in office or a Democrat in office. And here there's obviously in many states across the country, there's a rural-urban divide that can kind of be the thread that you can see in terms of conflict of governance. But here in Oregon, there is a huge kind of militant anti-government faction of the right that is very organized. I think most of the time, unless you tread on their sense of liberty, they pretty much stay to themselves. But because of shifting policies and probably what they would consider to be intrusion onto their way of life, they do have this very kind of aggressive and militant wing that will sometimes take action against the government or against other people like Antifa or BLM, or the people of the kind of cities that are trying to intrude on their way of being out in like the most rural parts of Oregon that like nobody goes to. So yeah, no, the conflict is there. Yeah.
It's a wild thing. In Michigan, we have like the militias,
Mm-hmm.
and that just tried to execute a plan to kidnap Governor Whitmer, but we don't have the same sort of left politics out here. Most of that would be coming from like University of Michigan, and those are pretty much they're hippies. They aren't like the anarchist left or anything of that nature. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that's pretty interesting. When you were at Evergreen State, I saw you post on Twitter that one of your professors was Brett Weinstein. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Were you there when kind of all the stuff went down with? Uh, so I just started reading about this. Could you kind of describe what happened and what it was like being there? What was your experience of that?
Sure. Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, it's funny because I haven't really corrected my story with what people view it as from the outside. There's very much like a kind of internal or, a from within perspective that I hold. And a lot of that just comes from knowing Brett and Heather so well. At the time, I wasn't in Brett's class. I was in a whole different wing of the college taking ceramics and woodworking and doing a different kind of uh, investigation at the time. But what we've been following over the course of the year was a conflict that had to do with power shifting in the school. And we had a new president that was hired, and he was bringing in new policy changes. Evergreen is a college that was founded on the principle of faculty really driving the curriculum. And it has an interdisciplinary structure where you take one 16-credit program with two professors, and those two professors design that program themselves. There's no, authoritative kind of structure from the college itself that requires teachers to have a certain pedagogical approach. So Evergreen was like this place where if you really wanted to do kind of creative curriculum and dig into the nuances between subjects and kind of break down the very specialized way that academia has formed itself, particularly over the last 100 years in America, um, Evergreen was a great college to teach at for those reasons. And Brett and Heather took full advantage of this, and I can personally attest to how well designed their programs were. I mean, Heather in particular is just like an incredible curriculum designer. She would draw in all of these different threads and synthesize all these different subject matters. They had all sorts of different ways of getting into the material through theory, through research, through activities, through self-directed projects that were all very unique to their specific learning uh, intentions. And for the class itself, there was a lot of very organic interaction between the professors and the students. And the administration was beginning to want to encroach on faculty's, authority in the classroom. And Brett was really voicing discontent about those changes. And what he was pointing out that became so volatile was that it was being cloaked in the language of diversity and inclusion in order to basically, as a Trojan horse, bring in these policy changes that would end up undermining the creative authority that professors had in their classrooms, which he was vehemently against. So he was coming out kind of in two primary ways. One was look at what they're doing, look at this Trojan horse, don't fall for it. And then the second one was like, they're using the language of diversity and inclusion to basically to like cast this, sacred cow so that nobody can say anything about it. And everyone just fell in line, like all the professors, all of the administrators, even most of the student body just completely fell in line with the narrative. And he became the scapegoat of everyone's hatred. It was incredible to watch. Like, it was really incredible, so contentious. Like my dissonant views, I mean, at the time I was really caught between two worlds. Like, I was both close to them, and both of them had really shown up for me during some very like personal changes that were going on in my life, and had really been that's how they were. They were really involved with their students when their students opened up to them. And I had trust for them and with them that went beyond just like the kind of relationship that teachers may have with their students. And so to watch everyone treat Brett in particular with such suspicion was really wild. But at the same time, I was living with a bunch of anarchists. Oh my God. They were going to protest him.
They were going to protest him. That's
yeah.
interesting. That's an interesting thing about a lot of aspects of the maybe we could call them the libertarian left, right? That they rail against the authoritarian impulses of institutions, and yet sociocultural forces that might be authoritarian or oppressive, those things are oftentimes embraced.
Oh, yeah.
Ideological authoritarianism, like you have to believe this, that sort of thing, looms large. Like, are you a true believer in this ideology or this approach? If you're not, then we probably can't trust you. And I think that that's born of real risks, especially for like anarchists, for example, right? They're enemies of the state largely. And so you got to be careful about who you trust, especially if you're plotting things to try to advance the anarchist ideology. So there are certain kind of acid tests, like, or litmus tests, whatever you want to call them, to are you really one of us? Do you actually believe these sorts of things? And those are embraced out of necessity to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, to use a biblical reference.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. What were some of the what were the educational intentions of the programs that you took while you were at Evergreen State? You said you were doing like woodworking and ceramics, and was that just part of it, or were you doing other things? I mean, you're obviously very involved and interested in philosophy now. Was that born of your university experience, or is that a personal interest?
Yeah, I didn't touch philosophy while I was at Evergreen. I think I had some really intuitive, unconscious allergies to certain kinds of communities. So, and that included classrooms. So the benefit that I got from being in classes with Brett and Heather, which was, a lot of stress testing of ideas, they had this beautiful way of being able to push their students to kind of examine their assumptions and think through different kinds of paradoxes. Brett was particularly good at this, where you would come to him with a question and he would answer you with a riddle, and you wouldn't be able to crack it, in conversation with him. So they would just like lodge in your mind this like paradox, and you just like turn it around, turn it around, turn it around until finally you would have this moment where you're like, oh, that what he's saying? Like what? He's become so much more clear in his recent content with the public. But when he was a professor, oh my God, it was just like impossible to get a straight answer out of him. He was totally elusive. And so his strategy really was, if you want to know something and you want to ask me, like, we're going to engage in this play. And through this play, you will have to learn for yourself. And I will be here to kind of, volley with you, but I am not the one who has the answers. Um, and that was sometimes very frustrating for students because they wanted to go up and, ask the question and get the answer, which is certainly a kind of way of approaching school that seems very commodified to me. Like here I am I'm the customer and I'm purchasing my education. And that means the teacher is the one who is, I'm buying the service from. And so if I have a question, then they are obligated to answer me in a way that I can understand so that my transaction is being fulfilled. And of course, that's not historically the way teaching has been approached. I mean, you hear about the stories of Zen masters who, you know, some monk comes to ask them a question and they leave even more confused than when they came. And I think Brett definitely had that kind of approach. But then there were other classrooms, especially in like media studies, that were very into identity politics and critical race theory, very into the theories of like queerness and like disability politics, very politically oriented. And those were kinds of their own cults of personality. While there were cults of personality around like Brett and Heather, there were cults of personality around other professors who taught different kinds of things. And I just had the good sense to stay away from it. I don't know. I really don't know. I could have easily gone a different way. I'm I I'm baffled in many ways that I just like had the good fortune to sniff out a different path. And I mean I have like a kind of psychological maybe counterfactual or like be like maybe it was this thing or maybe it was that thing, but ultimately I don't really know. Some of us just were attracted to what Brett and Heather were bringing to the table, and ultimately it's ended up being whatever that force is. That's been the kind of golden thread that I've been following as I continue to do intellectual inquiry in my life. and it's become much more prominent. It's become much more clear that curiosity and independent thought is really the thread that I wish to pull. And I could become closer to it, every day as I continue to interrogate the mysteries of the world that we have inherited.
What are some of the key questions that you've asked as you've been pulling on the thread?
Yeah. Well, right now, I've been thinking a lot about eggs.
Eggs.
Mhm. About eggs. Uh,
Edible kind, the
yeah,
fertilizable kind.
I
The
mean, aren't they kind of the same?
They are, yeah, they are. But I mean, at some point, I think that I think that they change. Uh, there's
Yeah.
something that, yeah, at some point they're no longer the fertilizable eggs and they turn into the edible kind. Yeah,
Yeah, they do. They seem to occupy different categories in our
they do.
minds. Their sterility, their sterility, having been separated from their place of fertilization, they become sterile, and that way they become edible. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I right now, and especially since COVID hit, which has been an interesting experience to just have all of the kind of distractions and pulls of day-to-day life very suddenly just disappear, has really brought me into relationship to my body and being in the condition of the female body and what that really means, what the potential of my body is, and what it holds kind of symbolically or metaphysically. I've been reading Sexual Personae by Camille Paglia over the last months, like with a reading group. So I've been kind of investigating all of these different sexual personae, and particularly how women, the concepts and character associations with women have changed throughout the Western canon, and also the hermaphrodite, of course, the androgen, the go-between, and then the male, also the masculine principle changing. And I'm finding myself drawn into questions about what it means to be a woman more and more than I ever have before. And part of part of that is just almost defiance.
Defiance of what?
Oh my God. I mean, I just think that
Everything?
uh, I think that there's so much confusion about what it is to be a human, what it is to have a body, to be a body. I mean, to be in the process of becoming through a body. Uh, and it could be that our Cartesian dualism has finally reached this like peak schizophrenia, especially with the kind of imminence of that form in the internet, right? Where our heads are cut off and you know, our avatars are just these kind of like floating faces. Uh, and how that splits, our experiences, how our minds are creating a sense of what the world is because we've leapt into this like this space that is only metaphorically a space. And that's what's so strange about the internet. It's only metaphorically spatial because we are spatial entities. And so it interfaces into our existence in this way where we think we're coming to grasp what it is, but in fact, there is an illusory quality to it, and it's withdrawing its real nature and manipulating us. And I think that um, aspect of our experience as humans has really become accentuated, also due to coronavirus.
Yeah.
Um, and in the meantime, right, we're facing a plague, which you would think would bring people more intensely into the body. Um, and I think for some of us, it has. I think it's interesting to see conversations about embodiment becoming so popular in certain communities online, while simultaneously people are increasingly leaving behind their bodies and actually bringing the internet world into reality, which is, of course, also what I see happening on the streets of Portland. Um, but yeah,
Mm. So you think that maybe people Let's pull on that thread a little bit. The people who are going out into the streets in Portland, they're maybe what, like downloading a mind from the internet that maybe is disembodied, and then they take that with them out onto the streets, that mind, and they further cultivate it, and they commune with other people who have downloaded the same mindset, we could call it, right? And then those disembodied mindsets that largely only exist on the internet, like all of these sociocultural forces that are discussed on the internet, those don't show up in the same way in interpersonal relationships between just two people, right? A lot of the talk right now is not about one-on-one conflict between people of different genders, people of different races. It's about the systemic. And the systemic is it's a disembodied entity, right? The system is not made up of any corporeal form. The system is just out there. And so you download some aspect of the system into your mind and then go out into the street and try to actualize it, realize that. Is that what you're referring to, or did I just make all of that up?
No, I think that that's really spot on. I would say what's interesting about the structure of thought that we find ourselves kind of interfacing with is exactly what you pointed out. Anything that is be systemic is inherently abstract. It's inherently gesturing at some sort of elusive force. It's like slippery. It can't be really held. And so I think it's interesting how it basically creates this cascading effect where you can see the manifestations of this kind of withdrawn force in all of these small circumstances. And that's what becomes this it's almost like a perverse scapegoating mechanism where instead of the community coming together around a single entity that kind of symbolizes all of the hostility of the community, and in one moment you just crucify that one individual, and then you have release, and then you have this moment where you can actually go back to your day-to-day life and existence. It's almost like eating fast food, right? Where it's like you're not satiated when you persecute someone because they only elusively represent this abstract quality of the systemic patterns that are replicating themselves in the imminence of our human existence. So it's like it's a furnace, and the people who are persecuted become the fuel, and so it just continues to churn and churn and churn without having much of an end in sight. I don't know what ultimately will come to stop these forces besides individual people just refusing to acquiesce, refusing to be scapegoated, refusing to be persecuted by it. I think that that's why there's been a kind of emergence of the badge of honor for going through cancel culture, right? You kind of, the first time it happens to you, I think people get freaked out. They go through this like arc, um, which I completely understand. I fear it myself, right? And then you get through the other side, and then you get to join all these other people who've already gone through it. And then they get to the other side, like, oh, actually, now we're kind of protected from this.
Yeah.
We can just do and say and be however we want to. And in fact, there are a lot of people who will follow our content and give us money. And there's a whole other side, which of course the left calls like, you know, neo-reactionary or the alt-right or whatever. Like basically if you've passed through cancel culture to the other side, you've become like a deplorable. And it doesn't matter that the people who've been canceled, if that's your kind of categorization for them, you're talking about the most diverse group of people I think you you could ever think of.
Yeah.
Their opinions are so widely like distributed amongst all sorts of different like underlying ontologies, perspectives on human nature, prescriptions for how we live in the world. Like it's a very diverse group of people, and yet all of us are, or all of those people are called like alt-right, I'm just like,
Yep. It's an interesting thing because there are, though, economic forces that can incentivize people to lean into the accusations that have been leveled against them in order to draw the. So let's say that maybe they started off listening to their better angels and trying to speak up for what they thought was right or true, or at least shine light on a different perspective on a situation where maybe they thought that the dominant narrative was lacking. And then they get accused of being the enemy. And then they see that maybe there's some benefit in being the enemy, right? I can marshal forces of the other enemies. And so they start to lean into that and they get incentivized. I think that that's a little bit of kind of what we're seeing is on both sides, people leaning into the caricatures that the other side painted for them as a badge of identification of like, yeah, fine, I'll be what you say that I am so that I can be loud and proud and say, you know, anybody else who agrees with me, come, this is kind of the culture war grift that has been talked about before. It's like, yeah, come and give me your money. I'll be what they say I am. It's an interesting thing that is happening right now, pushing people to both ends. So how does this all relate to eggs? I'm still trying to get at.
how does that relate to eggs? Well, I'm really pretty, I think I've been failed by feminism, personally. So I don't, and I feel like there's this really, like there's this ripe kind of uh, fertile uh,
Yep.
area, not only for investigations that are political or like, moral or whatever, which I actually am like not that interested in. I think that that's like one of the last things you get to if you're building a new worldview. Your political engagement is like the final step. But first, you have to think about, your ontology. Like, what is this world that we're in? And I've been into philosophy pretty aggressively since I graduated college, and I love it. I like live and breathe it. I'm endlessly curious about what people have been thinking over the millennia and how they've really related to questions of human nature, of principles of the universe, metaphysics, epistemology, all of these things. And there's been certain topics that haven't really been covered. And those which are related to the principle of femininity from the female perspective have really not been spoken about that much. That's just a fact. You know what I mean? Like I'm not trying to say that as some sort of crusader for like equity. I really don't care that much about that. It's more just that we live in a time where women are having to examine who they are, with a whole different set of choices at the table for who to become. And you have to have curiosity to reach in and try and understand internally that which you are becoming that arises out of the condition of your body, and also understand how these things have been either left, like, represented, or I don't even want to use that word. How do I say this? How how women of the past have understood themselves. And that is really has been very related to fertility, and also how men have related to women as well, and that's very, very, very important. And then I also come from a perspective rooted in evolutionary biology and evolutionary theory, but I'm not, keeping myself merely to a scientific inquiry about these things. So I'm interested in the poetic and the mythic. And we talk about, the feminine principle as chaos, as, the Dionysian, as the anima, as in young. Uh, And I think that that is almost it's like a certain aspect of the feminine, but it's not quite the egg. It's not quite the egg. And the egg, to me, is where it all begins. It begins at this asymmetry at the bottom of sex, that you have a single form, that the male and the female of any species is the same form. They're of the same substance, but they are split into two asymmetrical beings that have to find each other. They have to travel vast distances to come together in the most intimate of ways. And that kind of individual being has to be sacrificed to create the unity of one. And that's what brings forth the future. So this asymmetry of sex is what I'm principally interested in. And the egg is, I'm privileging the egg for my own purposes.
Yeah, it's more relevant to you, I would say,
Yeah,
probably.
it is. I have them. I've carried
Yeah.
my eggs with me my whole life since I was in the womb. And I think that that in and of itself is this fascinating difference between men and women. And of course, the thing about it is the male and the female, it's like there are differences, obviously, but like you're looking at these, minute differences most of the time. It's like in reality, like we're all human. But if you're within the human context or within any species, and you're looking at the dynamics between the two aspects of that single species, confronting the differences of sex, I think, is one of the most intriguing questions to be investigating. So that's kind of how the egg fits in, I suppose.
I like it. I like it. It's an interesting time to be thinking about that, especially with quarantine and the lack of sex that a lot of people are experiencing due to much lower in-person contact and activity. And so it's kind of let's talk about evolutionary biology for a second, and maybe make a reductive claim that a lot of our behavior is driven by a desire to reproduce. Let's just throw that out there as a framing,
Yeah,
just for the sake of argument right now. Maybe we
we
could
can both
argue
agree
against.
on that.
Yeah. So with that being the case, and with this kind of this prohibitive constraint, it's not an enabling constraint whatsoever for us achieving those ends. This is a very interesting time for us to examine what does it mean to be a human who desires to engage in sex, engage in reproduction. Uh, yeah, it's very interesting.
It is, yeah, it is an interesting time because in many senses we've become involuntarily celibate. We've all become incels, um, but also there's an opportunity there to examine, like what has sex become? What has sex become? I mean, it's really changed, and a lot of that has to do with the shift in risk that women have inherited via technology, and the fact that now with taking on birth control and being effectively sterile, like sterilizing oneself, basically taking on a different kind of form that doesn't quite have all of its secondary sex characteristics, and in doing so, extending this period of, I mean, I would say it extends this period of adolescence almost to not take on the responsibility of a body that can be fertilized. And it's not something that all women want. And this is something that I've been investigating as well, which is women who choose to not engage in marriage. Um, so in history, we've had nuns, or we've had priestesses, or different kinds of female figures. The spinster, you know, the woman who never married, often lived with another woman, is definitely a character and an archetype. But also barrenness has been something I've been thinking a lot about. So women who are sterile in an involuntary way, and how that has worn on people, on women's like souls throughout history, and how they've approached living as barren women,
So
which I
I have
think.
a
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I have a funny story about that. When I was like I was middle school or something. I remember the day that it dawned on me that like I was surrounded by these women and they had this capacity to give birth, and I was very vocal with the my internal monologue, and I said it out loud to a girl who was sitting next to me. I said, "Isn't that incredible? Like that, like you could have a baby?" And she said, "Well, I actually can't." And I remember I was just mortified that I had, stuck my foot in my mouth in that way and kind of shine a light on something that was so personal just because of my internal musings. So I have a very personal relationship with that experience. It was not pleasant. Um,
Yeah, it's a very sensitive topic.
it is.
And I think you can see that also in the discourse around who is a woman. So obviously, the word woman has been very contested as to who even has a relationship to that label. And it's interesting, at least the way that I've been kind of thinking about this, because it's a delicate space. I accept the idea that there are trans women. And yet, I also do not want to exclude myself from talking about issues of womanhood that a trans woman would not be able to understand. And that's also why the egg becomes an important focus for me, rather than the uterus or the vagina or the vulva. Those are all things that, I mean, now even, maybe not quite the uterus, but the vagina can actually be constructed, and you can take on a vagina without having been born with one. But the egg remains elusive. You cannot just have an egg, in the same sense. And that aspect of the egg, of having an egg or being fertile or having the potential for fertility. And that's another question for me. What is fertility? But maybe we'll put that aside for now. But barrenness, as something that women have wrestled with throughout history for millennia, I think is a really rich place for understanding being trans, being a trans woman. And I'm like very curious about that. I haven't like really brought that forth in totally. I kind of had conversations here and there about it, and people are like, "Oh, that's really interesting. I had never like really thought about it in that way." But I find that that's maybe a possible way that the conversation can go from being animosity towards people who are breeders to actually an invitation into the conversation that women have been having amongst themselves throughout history about, and the conflict that women have been having internally around who can bring forth children and who cannot, who brings forth the right children, boys, and who bring forth the wrong ones, girls, principally. Like all of those things have been part of the lives of women for millennia. And yet, the way that the conversation is going nowadays, it's like we've forgotten that birth has never been a right. It's always been an act of fortune. And so the pain that someone feels when they can't give forth life, or they're not totally, you know, a woman, let's say, it's like, yeah, talk to your great 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 grandmothers. Like, they had sisters that weren't able to give birth, and they had to work with them through that. So that's something that I'm also working on, is like, how can we bridge all of these different ways that people are relating to this idea of being a woman and actually include, based on historical, very deep historical questions and conditions.
Yeah. What do you think are some of the psycho-spiritual ramifications of that? Both the induced sterility that comes with birth control, or the experience of like a trans woman, for example, of having this internal experience of being a woman and not giving birth, having that not be an aspect of her experience. What do you think the what are we dealing with here in terms of the decoupling of sex from reproduction, in terms of how that affects the minds of women? You spoke about like not having that responsibility thrust on you, and there are ways in which responsibility being thrust on you is both a can be a hindrance, but it also can be a significant growth opportunity. And so by stopping that temporarily or permanently, there are certain changes in your experience of being a woman that will be put off for a long time. I was thinking the other day about uh, the way that reproduction used to go in human societies. People very young, very, very young, pretty much as soon as you were able, you would start to give birth. And we didn't deal with the same uh, socioeconomic issues that we deal with now, of not being able to raise a child so young because of the education system and not being able to get a job where you can afford it, those sorts of things. Back then, there were tribal mechanisms that enabled you to have children very young, and that was the way of things. Now we put that off significantly. I mean, what do you think the ramifications of that are for the psychic development of women nowadays?
Yeah. Well, I think you went going back to that question you asked me earlier. This is one of the questions. It's very, very big. I mean, I think its investigation could last a lifetime. Um, but I think very generally, the picture that I'm seeing is that there is an unconscious force acting in this dimension, which is a lot of confronting kind of these changes in not only the technological interventions that we could make into our bodies, but also, like you're saying, the social and economic opportunities and conditions that we all have. You know, men are also delaying families, and uh, they have to be with a woman or be in a situation where they can find the possibility of having a child. But this is something that both men and women do share and are delaying. And it's, I think, a matter for me of the danger of mimesis. So I do think that there seems to be a kind of force that is arising from people internally that is telling them not to have children. And I think that those people should listen to that. That has been also a common aspect of human life. And there have been, those who take a vow of chastity and they become the shamans or they become the monks, or they live a different kind of life than the rest of society. And those people are out there, and you would imagine that there would be more total numbers of them now that we live in a world with so many people. But I think the problem is that women have really been encouraged to see themselves as working for their careers, and to taking on the responsibilities and the roles of men in society. And I think it's pretty, I don't know, reasonable to admit that the public sphere and the sphere of work has been defined by men and has been made in relationship to the kind of body that they have. The fact that they aren't the ones that carry life, that their form, once they take on all of their secondary sex characteristics, pretty much stays consistent throughout their life. Their fertility really doesn't change that much. It's like once you move into your male form, it's kind of as long as you take care of it, you're pretty good for like decades. Whereas a female body, I mean, it's like it's just change all the time. It's just continuous change. Like over the course of my life, I'm going to be many different women. Many different women. I've already been many different women. And that's something that arises out of my body because I haven't interfered with my cycle. So I just like let it come and it comes. And I'm like, whoa, my consciousness is like, what the hell? Because consciousness is always kind of trailing behind a little bit. And like observing and being like, what is happening here? And fertility for women is like, it has a trajectory, it has a peak and it has a decline. And your hormones change in relationship to that. And there's a kind of window that a woman has to take up the opportunity to seize if she's going to kind of enact the full potential of the fertility that is latent in her body, that she may have actually intervened in creating, closing the gates, let's say, and making it impossible for that fertility to actually come forth in the reality of impregnation, implantation, and subsequently birth. And there is a kind of mutually exclusive situation with the way that our labor is viewed and the social views also that come along with that. Like I don't know, for just a personal example, my grandmother, I was talking to her the other week, and I was telling her that I'm principally interested in having a family and that I'm prioritizing that. So I'm interested in finding a long-term partner, in getting married, in starting to have children. And my grandmother, who for work has been very, very important to her for her whole life, she was that kind of first generation of women that really took to the workforce and were able to build their own wealth. She bought her own house. She paid for her children's education with her own money. Like it was very important for her that she was a woman that worked and was able to provide for herself and didn't need her husband the way that her mother had needed her husband. And when she heard me, she's like, what? and this is my grandmother, right? So that's the other thing. It's multiple generations. And my mom, she passed away. Actually, that's like the thing that happened to me while I was in school with Brett and Heather. So I don't know what she would say to that, but I think she would be just like scratching her head, like, what the hell are you doing, girl? Like she was also a career woman. She really was so dedicated to work. Like she had a child, me, by accident, and I don't know that she would have had a child without that accidental nature to it. And I just have a different view. And this goes back to the mimesis, right? So in my world, had I never questioned that I was supposed to go to work, and I was supposed to work on a career, and that I was supposed to take on this understanding of myself as essentially male, just with this, different reproductive system, I maybe would have led myself into a great deal of suffering. And I think that that's the thing that women are not surfacing early enough. They're waiting for the moment where the drive to have a child becomes so strong that it hits them, and basically they can't even focus on work. They can't even focus on the things that have been important to them, because there's this physical drive that's arising out of their body that comes into their mind, and the fantasy is so strong that they'll go to such crazy lengths to make it happen. And you're seeing this borne out in the fertility industry. And I mean, we were talking earlier about charlatans. Like, oh my God, there is so much exploitation and just snake oil in the fertility industry. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that women are delaying having children and even checking up or paying attention to their fertility until they're in their late 30s. And then once they get there, they're like, oh my God, I've been on birth control for 2 decades. I don't even know what it means to like be in my, ovulation. I don't even know what my fertility looks like, what it feels like. And I'm trying to have a baby. And I only have a few years to make all of this happen before I start to get into a very risky territory with giving birth, particularly to a first child, which is the riskiest birth typically. Um, and I think this is latent. Unfortunately, this is just something below the surface. It's like bubbles up in these weird kind of reactions to like trad women, for example. Or there was that picture, I don't know, that went around on Twitter of that like really beautiful blonde family. It was like a woman with her like 7 kids, and people just freaked out about it. They were like, this is horrible. This is the worst thing. This is the worst thing anybody could do. How could these people possibly be having this many kids? And people throw the environmentalist thing in, they throw the feminist thing in. But there's a really strong kind of anti-natalist uh, cultural paradigm on the left. And it puts women in a weird spot where they're suppressing or, looking towards other kinds of forms of value and meaning rather than going inward and getting in touch with their bodies and what the drives of their bodies are telling them to do. Unfortunately, for me, I've tapped into the drives of my body. And guess what? I'm like, oh, I don't want to be a capitalist subject. I want to be outside of that entirely. I want to be at home raising my children. And that doesn't make me a very good Protestant. It doesn't make me a very good, like capitalist. In fact, it teaches me that I have everything I already need to make the life that I want. And what becomes most important then is finding my partner, finding a man, which is also not very like popular to talk about. So I think that there's just so many things that kind of create these psychological aversions to coming into the body. And it's just the cost of that for women is really high if you got it wrong. If you're one of those people who just happens to know for sure that you're not going to have a child, all of this kind of mimetic stuff is fine for you because you just realize that the thing that everyone's been telling you to do is the thing that you wanted to do all along. Yeah. But if you're a woman who really does want to listen to that drive to have a child, I mean, there's just so much pain.
Is there like somewhere hiding in the corner of Reddit, like a spiritual movement that encourages women to not take birth control, apart from the Christian
Catholic Church?
Well, I was just going to say, apart from the religious institutions that are like go forth and multiply because you're a woman and that's your job, but women who are looking at it from more of a naturalistic perspective of it's beneficial for us if we go through these things, experience the ebb and flow of these desires to reproduce, to have children, that there's some spiritual benefit to that. Almost, I'm thinking of an equivalent as like, no fap within like men's movements, right? It's like, no, you shouldn't not masturbate because the God says that it's wrong. There's actually real mental, physical, spiritual benefits to abstaining from masturbation. And I'm wondering if there's some equivalent cultural movement with women of being like, don't take birth control, embrace your body. There's there's physical and spiritual benefits to that. Is that out there somewhere that I'm not aware of?
You know,
You could start
I
it, Raven. You can have that
no,
idea. I give
that's
it to you right
actually
now.
no, that's my thing actually, I would
Yeah.
say is I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to kind of, declare myself as some leader of some sort of, group as yet, but that's kind of what I see myself doing, and wanting to flush out my own spiritual, metaphysical, and like philosophical position on some of these things. So, being the inheritor of the egg, being the inheritor of the womb, being the receiver of sperm, and also being the one who gives birth. And so, birth also as like a metaphysical or philosophical question. What does that mean? Where do we find it elsewhere? How can we understand it as a symbol? All of those things, and then also thinking about human potential. This is something that my friend, he pointed out. I was, pontificating about all of this stuff as I do. And he was like, Raven, this really reminds me of the logic of the bodybuilder movement, where they talk a lot about, building your body for it to reach its full potential, right? And you renounce everything that has a cost on your body and basically restricts it in its capacity to reach this peak potential. So you give up alcohol, you give up smoking, you give up sugar, you drink a bunch of eggs. Um,
You slunk
what
them.
did you?
You
You
slunk the
slunk
eggs.
the eggs. You slunk the eggs. Um, and I was like, oh my God, this is a really interesting connection because I think in many ways, how I have been conceiving of this is of the matter of human potential, of female potential, of the realization or the actualization of fertility, and how that actually, in a bodybuilding type way, does relate to not drinking, not smoking, not sleeping like irregularly, being very attentive to your cycles. So that means not being on birth control that interrupts the hormonal changes in your body. And also, it means a kind of keen excitement, interest, curiosity about pregnancy. Pregnancy is one of these kinds of transformative experiences. I think women get to go through many metamorphoses. This kind of goes back to the idea of the female body changing continuously over time. And each pregnancy is a new world. Like there's commonalities, but each pregnancy has some differences to it. And a woman's mind, and body changes physiologically when she holds her baby and when she breastfeeds. And there's just so much going on there that I think is like so like rich to be understood from a metaphysical perspective. And I don't want it to be trite, or whatever, that like fixates on the body in this way that kind of uh, like cuts the body apart from the person. I think that that's something that feminism has kind of moved into, where it like reduces the woman to the vagina, or reduces the woman to even like just the vulva or the breast, the exposure of the breast, or just the facade of the female body. So I'm like, I don't want to get into that. I think that's a trap, a potential trap, and I think also this happens in the male version of this, where they get really hyper focused on the aesthetic and they don't really tap into the process of transformation that you're going through internally that's being realized through this imminent corporeal flesh that we have the gift of inhabiting in this life. So there's definitely a human potential thing kind of threaded into this, that I find interesting. But
Yeah, there was something that as we were talking about like women and the various ways that women have been defined throughout the ages and that they're continuing to be defined, like what is a woman? That's still a question that's very much up in the air these days. And it feels a little bit like a similar phenomena with God and the process of identifying the God of the gaps. So
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, God was responsible for everything. And then as science gradually determined the mechanisms by which things behaved, God got smaller and smaller and reduced down to just, well, God is everything that we don't understand now, but through science. It feels like maybe a similar thing is happening with the definition of womanhood now, where, I mean, just to reduce it down to biological sex characteristics, whereas before it was a whole lot more in terms of like sociocultural function and personality traits and things of that nature, and the archetypal, the mythopoetic uh, role of women and mothers and things of that nature. To reduce it down to this question of do you got the equipment or not seems reductive and contra- contrary to the purposes of pretty much all feminism, I would say, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's really quite bizarre. Because there's like this twofold thing going on. We talked about this earlier, where you have this like hyperfixation on the head and the avatar, which I think gets people into this situation where they're very interested in the exterior, like the outside of their membrane, right? And the way that it looks and how it defines them and how other people perceive it and how they perceive the outside of others. And that does kind of change the relationship to the body where it gets cut up. You know, it's like cut up, cut off the breasts, like cut up, cut off the vulva. Like, it becomes very much this like almost like the gaze just fixates on the hypernormal kind of stimulation of certain parts of the body and accentuates or exaggerates those aspects as being all encompassing, or yeah, reduces. And that's so weird because in a sense it's very scientific materialist, right? To delineate, to slice, to categorize, to cut, to focus on only that which is perfectly immanent and can be described uh, using functional language as to what it does. And it almost is what it does. There's no room for any other kind of purpose. There's no room for any other kind of meaning in that metaphysics. And it's, I mean, it can understand why people are nihilistic and ironic and cynical. I mean, when you live in that kind of world, I mean, it's almost like the vacuum, where it's very difficult, I think, to live when you are disconnected from your form.
Very reductive, yeah.
It's terrible.
It is not a fun way to live. I've lived that life before, where
I know.
that was my perspective, my worldview. It's not a fun way to live. Uh, Something that you touched on before in terms of the changes that you undergo as a woman as you have these experiences of pregnancy, motherhood, and all the things that come along with that, breastfeeding and stuff. I actually had an interesting experience one time on a meditation retreat. So I was doing a 7-day meditation retreat on death. So it's called, within the tradition I practice in, it's called Marana Sati, or mindfulness of death. And we were doing a wide variety of exercises to try to uh, reflect on death, come to a more felt sense of what it's like to be a being that is going to die, those sorts of things. So as I sat through this retreat and I reflected on this death, I did a variety of things in order to try to really induce that the imminent sense of my own demise. One of those things was to go out into the mountains in California at night alone. And while I was out there, I encountered an animal that I don't know what it was, but it, like, I heard it walking. I shined my light out there. I saw two green eyes. I saw him disappear, and I saw him pop up closer. And in that moment, I had no idea what I should do in order to preserve my own life or whether or not I was going to be able to. I didn't know whether to run or to stay still, to be loud or quiet, to shine the light, to not shine the light. I had no idea what to do. And I had to sit with this imminent possibility of my own death because it could have been a mountain lion very easily. There were mountain lions where I was. When I came back to the retreat, like the next day, that was a pretty profound experience. And I sat and I became extremely concentrated. And at some point, it's really hard to describe, but in my mind's eye, I looked down and I had breasts. And there was a child at my breast, and I was nursing it. Or at least I thought that I was nursing it. I actually don't know now whether or not I was the mother or the child. The perspective was that of the mother and nursing the child. But I mean, that was a transformative experience for my practice of what we call metta or loving kindness. The sense of loving kindness that I had in that moment for this child was overwhelming. And it's still an experience I draw upon when I'm practicing loving kindness meditation, trying to send out love and caring to the world. That was a transformative experience. And I wasn't even actually a mother, right? In that moment, I mean, it was indistinguishable from having been the mother because I was in a very deep state of concentration. But I mean, that was a transformative experience for me. And to think that there are real changes and our world would be a completely different place culturally, socially, if there were more experiences of motherhood. Like, I don't know if the percentage has gone down in terms of the percentage of people at any given time who have given birth, let's say, right, out of the total population. But I have to assume that it's gone down for our generation significantly, and probably the generation before us as well. I think that has profound, psychological impacts on women and in turn the societies that they participate in. For you, I mean, what are some of the things that you found in your own exploration of this that you think will change for yourself? Like, you obviously you've said this, you desire to have children. What is that desire born of? What sort of transformation are you seeking? Is it more that you're drawn to it, or are you driven to it?
Hmm. Oh, I mean, I'm driven to it.
You're driven to it. It's
It's
an
it's
internal
like it's like the core of my ambition as a person.
interest.
It is my ambition, and I think that this connects me to the matriarchs of history. Um, Women have sought power through their lineage, through their children. I mean, you see this in the Bible, in the Old Testament. There are figures. I think Rebecca is the one who she really gets involved with Jacob, like the situation with his father, and kind of situating him in such a way that he could actually get his blessing and go to kind of seed this great nation, and Jacob becoming Israel, right? And and that being the source of the nation of Israel in terms of its lineage. So I think that you can see these examples when we kind of get into the perspective of the women of history, which, depending on the text that you're working from, is more like glimpses. But you get this idea that ambition for a woman was very connected to her children, the amount of children that she had, who she had children with, and the talents, capabilities, and world that those children were inheriting. So I think that that's something I have just found myself burrowing into. Like, my ambition, I've always been very ambitious. That's just been part of my disposition as a person. Very much someone who's like driven to move and to change things and to bring forth my vision of the world, often failing, as people who are ambitious and young often do. But it was directed in different kind of towards different interests, towards different visions. And I think with quarantine, something that's happened to me is all of these other pulling forces, all of these other possible ways that I could channel that ambition have dissolved. And what was left in all of that uncertainty, what I knew that I was always going to be driven to do, was to go through the transformative experience of becoming a mother. And when I had that insight, I was just like, well, I guess might as well just, I mean, like, you can't turn back from it. Essentially,
Yeah.
it was, this is the core. And I had this intuition as well that part of it is about adultification, right? This process of becoming and moving out of my kind of extended adolescence and turning into an adult woman, which I think for me is deeply connected to birth and becoming a mother. And I suspect that when I've moved through that process, I will have some kind of wisdom and understanding that I don't have now.
Mm-hmm.
And I could never fabricate that. It's only something that I can walk through as a kind of initiation. And once I have had that experience, I will be able to reflect on it means that I had this kind of prophecy or this drive, and that I have moved through the risk of that experience and moved through all of the emotional and kind of identity challenging aspects of something like becoming a mother. And also, I think having a connection to my own mother, which is the other thing that kind of really impacted me, was losing my mother at 19 years old. Um, Basically, put me in a position of never really knowing who she was, never being able to have a conversation with her about who, she was apart from being a mother, but also what it was like for her to become a mother and to see her children grow and how her identity changed and her sense of her purpose in life. All of those questions go unanswered by her voice from her corporeal form. But the thing that I think I can do is empathize, like what you're saying, of like going into this almost this like imminent experience where you take on the perspective of something else and suddenly you can understand it so deeply that it would be as if, and this, connects to my acid trip, where like I became my mother in this very literal way. And I realized that like I am becoming her. And in doing so, I'm connecting to her in a way that even a conversation, wouldn't really have been sufficient to embody. And it's really walking through the life of my mother and seeing it from her perspective, or trying to, that gives me this connection that otherwise I don't think that I would ever get to talk to her about those things in my life. Um,
A way of
so
answering questions that you won't ever get the chance to ask. It's very interesting. I like it. So I'm going to put some words in your mouth for a second, and you can challenge me if I'm wrong. You would reject the notion that men are the one who have kind of thrust the reproductive responsibility onto women as their primary utility. You think that that's born more so from being a biological woman? Is that right?
it's such a weird way to think of that. I mean, it's
What
so
is the way that I
strange.
said it?
Yeah, I mean that perspective, because some people, I mean, that's totally something that honestly, I think a lot of that has to do with the recent history that we've inherited, which has also included a lot of gender conflict. Even, we think of our like mothers or grandparents, but like, I mean, in the I mean, particularly like I'm more familiar with like what was happening like kind of in England and in Europe, but women were getting educated and women were starting to get involved in politics, and they were writing under male pseudonyms, and they were getting involved in philosophy. They were beginning to do science. This was particularly the case in England, where there was just such an excess of resources being drawn into the aristocracy that people just didn't have to work in the same way. And a lot of that benefit went to women, to daughters. They were taught Latin. You know, they were smart. They were smart women, and they created stuff. They made a lot of things, and I think that um, that is something we've kind of inherited. We've inherited the way that men during those times dealt with the fact that there were women who were not just being educated for, you know, the value of the male status, but they were being educated and then not getting married. You know, you think of like the Bronte sisters, like writing in England and living their kind of spinster life together. And I think that there's a way in which that was seen as maybe a kind of sign of the greater changes to come, and tapped into anxiety that I think anybody probably at the time was experiencing as well. I think there's something in human psychology where we want to scapegoat towards certain demographics of people or certain individuals, conditions that are kind of outside of any group that we're all just kind of having to cope with. And women being kind of portrayed in these ways that we're trying to keep them in where they had been historically, their places to in the hearth, in the home, taking care of the domestic affairs. And I think before that condition was the case, um, men and women kind of accepted their station in life because they were both condemned. I mean, both men and women have been condemned to work the labor that they were respectively tasked with. And this idea of mobility, this idea that we could be anything that we want to be, this idea that education can allow us to transcend drudgery is all very new. And we're in that kind of extended history. That's not just from yesterday, but is actually kind of part of the Enlightenment that we've inherited. And so I think that a lot of it is more due to that. And in other periods of time, I think it's fluctuated. I think that in some time periods, women have been excluded explicitly. Camille Paglia really points to this in Greek society. Women were, I mean, and she even theorizes that it was actually excluding women and turning away from women, and men creating their cult of masculinity, where the male was kind of put as the muse and worshipped and seen as like the highest form, that allowed for this like insight and kind of brilliance of male creativity to arise. So there is also this dynamic where men turning away from women is part of their initiation into the world of men. And I think sometimes that is enforced, or like a line is drawn with a kind of sexist perspective. But then on the other hand, you have the women who are just like talking about how dumb the men are, and how like, so I just think who was writing the history books, like the tradition of women has been oral, and that obviously has a very different kind of mark on reality. The mark on reality is healthy pregnancies. The mark on reality is like smooth family relationships, good marriages, like good just political or social decisions, making it through tough times. That women have been very attentive to changes that bring more risk to the family, and we're very good at like kind of figuring out or having a intuitive kind of premonition about how to protect the lineage. And so Yeah, I think it's a complex issue. I don't think that it was something that men chose for women. It's more of the
Yeah.
post hoc kind of rationalization of what that means, that there are these two different sexes.
Mm, I like it. What do you think that the adoption of that way of thinking has done to male female relationships in terms of our ability to get along with each other, our ability to actually engage in relationships that result in reproduction? I mean, we have a at the same time that we have what some may say overpopulation, which we can debate whether or not that's actually the case. There's also fertility crises in a lot of developed nations. And that's born of a wide variety of things: access to technology, the social narrative that we should be working and, productive members of society, even women. And that inherently oftentimes reduces fertility rates. But on the interpersonal level, just on one, the ideas of feminism, things of that nature. What do you think that that's done to the relationship between men and women?
Yeah. Well, I think I think in some ways I would argue that feminism is a symptom, but this is just a more general thing where like uh the ideologies or the explanations that arise are symptomatic of like greater changes that are happening in the environment, and then people once again kind of scapegoat certain manifestations uh in order to try and cope with what is really some sort of greater change that they have merely inherited and cannot actually truly escape. Um, and I think feminism has really reinforced a certain kind of perspective on that change that has had a very confusing effect on people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's putting it nicely. I mean, I honestly think that it's ruined people's lives
Yep.
um, in a really tragic way. I think that there's a great deal of tragedy in what's happening between the sexes. Because, and maybe this is a romantic notion, but I mean, I was raised on 90s sitcoms and, you know, chick flicks, rom-coms. Like, there is this, there's this deeply seated idea uh, in the stories and in the ways in which we think about romance as children that I think has been defiled by a lot of the ideological positions that millennials and now Zoomers are kind of inheriting as revolutionary acts. And I think that that's really part of it too, is this like drive towards novelty and novelty being equated with revolutionary change and the old ways as being trite and archaic, and the need, like just this like almost kind of crazed necessity to embrace what is completely and totally new and reject anything that has this tinge of continuity with deep history. And that feminism kind of fits into that. It's like proposing this new way forward for women. And then men also sign up for it too. And I think that that's kind of complex in its own right, because I think a lot of men want to do what's right by women because they're actually good men who are not sexist, and really are curious about women, and really do want to understand their experiences and want to support their work, want to see their voices heard. They want to, I mean, I think in some cases they want to like protect and care for the women in the world around them. And they feel very drawn to that kind of role or relationship with women, even women who are not, they're not romantically interested in, or they're they're in a kind of friendship, almost like a brother to sister relationship. There's this very amicable way that men extend um, their help and their kindness to women. And now, because we have these like ideological lenses, those things are seen as like suspicious kinds of behaviors. It's called mansplaining. It's considered to be uh, something to suspect, and men then withdraw, from doing those types of things, or they just don't know what to do. And then in some aspects of the kind of, manosphere, whatever, women once again kind of become these evil creatures, that are like the devil, who are withholding what to these men they like deserve, which is like sex and reproduction or the good life or whatever.
It's a good
Like
one.
women become the gatekeepers of that which men are destined to kind of need in order to be validated in reality, which I also think is a terrible dynamic. And there's all of these insights that I think men need to have about their relationship to women, and that women need to have about their relationships to men, and the kind of ideologies that put notions in your head before you think about them yourself really lead you astray. Lead people astray in general about what the signals of those dynamics mean, instead of just playing and investigating and trying things out, which would have been the historical situation. You would have like gone out and like seen what it was like to interact with different kinds of people. You would have formed your own models. You would have talked to, the women in your life or the men in your life. You would have tried to figure out how to navigate your relationships, maybe turn to a religious text or two, a novel, to kind of build your own idea. And now it's like, before you even ask to know, someone is telling you, which I think is like extremely tragic, because that becoming is, I think, at core of what is like mysterious and beautiful about going through the full potentiality of your life cycle as a person. It's that investigation from your own perspective. And I think intimate relationships, particularly romantic ones, because there's a singularity aspect to them, where they not only have, the kinds of intimacy of friendship and the intimacy of like maybe doing work with somebody, but they also have this potentiality of like long-term partnership, and in some cases the potentiality of bringing forth life into the world. And it's so dense. It's like the egg yolk. It's where all of the things kind of come together and dwell in this singularity. And so to be able to investigate that secret world that only you and this other person can occupy, and really live through the identity and like physical and spiritual, metaphysical transformation that can result in a literal being, many literal beings like running around and making themselves in the world, I think is like one of the most beautiful kind of gifts of like human intimacy, that one who is called to that path can be so fortunate to accept and to be driven towards. And the fact that people are like, have all of these things now mediating their capacity to actually live forth that kind of mythopoetic life with another person, is just deeply tragic. And I don't know. It's really sad.
It is. I think that it's become more dangerous to try things, basically, in your relationships, especially between the sexes, between people with different cultural backgrounds, things of that nature. There's not a way. There's no social mechanism by which we can explore in a way where there's like bumpers that keep you within the lane but give you latitude to move around within it. Those have kind of been removed, and there's ditches on both sides that are have fire inside of them, and you'll burn and perish if you fall into them. So you better stick on the straight and narrow. That's how it feels, at
Yeah,
least to me.
it's very conservative.
Yeah.
It's very like rigid and fragile,
It is.
and it's very it's very sad. But my advice,
Let's hear
I
it.
have found as a woman who knows what she wants, people are very receptive to me. Like I have basically so much choice. It's insane. So like the dynamic that has occurred now is that there's a scarcity of women who know what they want in terms of like romance and sex. And there are so many men who basically they don't they're like not bothered or moved by feminism. Like they don't believe it. They just like know for themselves because they're more antisocial. That goes back to this idea of like people being overly socialized. Like a lot of men are more antisocial and they just don't conform to what other people tell them to be, period. And they know themselves and they're on a process of discovery for themselves and they do it in a radically independent way and they would be formidable mates. And you can find them. I find them all the time. I find good men all the time. Like I feel like I am surrounded by good men. And I kind of have I just like can choose whoever I want, basically.
I love it. Oh
But
man.
nobody really approaches me. Like it really is in the hands of women. Like I really think that women taking on responsibility for choosing and going for the men that they're interested in and seeing it through is kind of one of these ways that you can kind of like hack the dynamic is um go find the men that you are interested in and then go spend time with them. Men are very accepting of women just like in their milieu is what I found in the communities that I run in. They're like excited to see a woman. They're like, "Oh my god, there's a woman here. Great." And they're very accommodating and they're very curious and I've made a lot of wonderful friends and I've never been like excommunicated or anything for, rejecting somebody sexually if they did happen to tell me that they had a crush on me or something. That's often a dynamic that you just have to kind of move through when you're of reproductive age and, all of those things exist. But once you do, like people are like, oh yeah, that's fine, I'll be your
I
friend.
think we glitched out.
But
Are you with
you
me?
can kind of like hack um hack the system if you're a woman and uh you know go after what you want and get it. That's my advice for the women out
I think
there.
a lot of I, yeah, I think a lot of babies are going to be born from this podcast. So thank you,
Yeah.
Raven. I appreciate it very much. Yeah.
Thank you,
Uh,
this was lovely.
oh, great. I'm glad you enjoyed it and look forward to
Yeah,
speaking again.
of course.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to see more from Breaking the Frame, please visit breakingtheframe.org. There you'll find writings, guided meditations, events, and other resources for learning to navigate between worldviews.